Hidden behind mountains, fortified borders, and decades of secrecy lies one of the most isolated and enigmatic nations on Earth, North Korea. A country where the world's most powerful militaries, nuclear arsenals, and diplomatic strategies collide with a society shaped by famine, ideology, and myth. How did this nation, born from colonial resistance and Cold War division, come to endure decades of hardship under the shadow of an unbroken dynasty? From the guerrilla campaigns of a young revolutionary in Manchuria to a modern state whose cities gleam with propaganda and high-rises, yet whose countryside struggles for survival. The story of North Korea is a tale of survival, control, and the extraordinary resilience of its people. In this documentary, we trace the history of the Korean peninsula from ancient kingdoms and imperial conquests to liberation, war, famine, and nuclear brinkmanship, revealing how history, ideology, and leadership have forged a nation unlike any other. This is the full story of North Korea, its origins, its myths, its people, and the uncertain path that lies ahead. Long before the borders of North and South Korea were drawn before the ideologies of Juche or the dynastic rule of the Kims, the Korean peninsula existed as a land of rivers, mountains, and dense forests, a landscape that shaped the lives, politics, and identity of its earliest inhabitants. Archaeological evidence suggests humans have lived on this peninsula for hundreds of thousands of years, with stone tools from the Paleolithic period discovered in sites across northern Korea, including Hwasun and Jong-il. These early humans were hunter-gatherers, navigating the rivers, valleys, and coastal plains, leaving behind rudimentary implements that hint at a capacity for survival in a land both generous and unforgiving. By the Neolithic period, circa 800 to 1500 BCE, communities had begun settling, farming millet and rice, and producing pottery with distinctive comb pattern designs. Sites like Amsadong near Seoul and early northern settlements in present-day North Korea reveal that these were not merely subsistence communities. They were social networks, experimenting with agriculture, fishing, and early forms of trade. Small clusters of dwellings and rudimentary burial mounds suggest that hierarchy and ritual were emerging even at this stage. Religion was deeply animistic. Shamans acted as intermediaries with spirits of the land, water, and ancestors, setting patterns of belief that would echo through centuries. The Bronze Age, c. 1500 to 300 BCE, brought transformative changes. Across the peninsula, metalworking enabled new tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects. Dolmens, stone burial mounds proliferated in northern Korea, evidence of a society increasingly concerned with status, lineage, and ritual. Agriculture improved with the introduction of iron tools, supporting population growth and more complex settlements. Around this period, proto-states emerged in the north. Confederacies such as Bio, Okgyo, and Dongil laid the groundwork for the kingdoms to come. These early polities were both political and cultural laboratories, experimenting with governance, alliances, and territorial control. Bio, in particular, would directly influence the rise of Goryeo, importing traditions of kingship, fortification, and diplomacy. Into this evolving tapestry comes the legendary kingdom of Joseon, often cited in Korean tradition as the first kingdom on the peninsula, founded in 2333 BCE by the semi-mythical figure Dangon. While historians note that Joseon's earliest archaeological evidence is more reliably dated to the 7th to 4th century BCE, its significance cannot be overstated. Joseon introduced central leadership, codified laws, and organized defense, creating a model for later states. It dominated northern Korea and parts of Manchuria, controlling trade routes and fostering early urban centers. Joseon's story is as much symbolic as historical. It anchored a sense of Korean identity, linking the people to a shared past and a shared land, and asserting claims over the northern territories that would become central to North Korean historiography. By the 4th century BCE, Gojoseon's political dominance declined under pressure from external forces, particularly the expansion of Chinese commanderies following the fall of the Wyman Joseon rulers around 108 BCE, when the Han dynasty established the Lelong Commandery near present-day Pyongyang. This marked a direct interaction between the Korean peninsula and Imperial China, with Chinese administrative, agricultural, and cultural practices influencing local elites. The commandery system introduced Confucian ideals, legal codes, and bureaucratic structures that would later resonate in the governance philosophies of Korean kingdoms. Lelong, in particular, became a center of trade, culture, and administration, linking northern Korea to the wider East Asian world. Artifacts such as bronze mirrors, coins, and Han-style pottery from Lelong testify to the blending of local and imported culture. As Gojoseon waned, the northern part of the peninsula fragmented into tribal federations. These groups, including Bio and Okgeo, were not isolated. They engaged in trade, military alliances, and cultural exchange. Bio, for example, is credited with transmitting early forms of monarchy, state ritual, and military organization to the emerging kingdom of Goryeo, which would be formally established in 37 BCE by King Dongmyong, Jamong. Goryeo's rise represents a direct continuation of the political and cultural experiments of the Bronze Age and Gojoseon legacy. Its people adopted both local customs and external influences from neighboring Chinese states, forming a kingdom notable for its military prowess, expansive territory, and fortification strategies. Goryeo expanded aggressively, constructing fortress cities in the northern mountains and along strategic river valleys. Its armies were well-trained, organized into a hierarchy that emphasized discipline and mobility. By the 3rd century CE, Goryeo had extended its territory deep into Manchuria, often clashing with Chinese kingdoms such as Wei and later Tang. Simultaneously, Goryeo became a cultural beacon, promoting the arts, early Buddhist practices, and governance techniques that would influence the entire peninsula. Meanwhile, in the southwest, Juche, traditionally founded in 18 BCE, developed a maritime-oriented civilization. Its coastal cities facilitated trade with the Japanese archipelago and southern Chinese kingdoms. Juche artisans produced intricate bronze and stone work, and by the 4th to 5th century CE, the kingdom became instrumental in transmitting Buddhism and Chinese writing systems to Japan. Diplomatic missions, envoys, and scholar travelers moved along these maritime corridors, creating cultural and technological exchanges that extended Korea's influence across East Asia. In the southeast, Silla, traditionally founded in 57 BCE, relied on mountainous terrain to secure its autonomy. Silla's rulers mastered diplomacy, often allying with China's Tang dynasty to counterbalance rival kingdoms. By the 5th century CE, Silla had established a sophisticated administrative system, fortified cities, and cultural institutions that emphasized ritual, education, and social hierarchy. Gold crowns, tombs, and ceremonial artifacts from this era reveal a society that was both materially affluent and deeply invested in symbolic representation of authority and divine favor. Trade, warfare, and cultural exchange among these kingdoms created a dynamic environment. Weapons, ceramics, and luxury items moved along both land and maritime routes. Early Confucian ideas, Chinese technological advances, and Buddhist teachings were selectively absorbed, producing a unique Korean synthesis. The peninsula's mountainous interior provided natural defense, fostering independence, while its rivers and ports facilitated connectivity with larger East Asian networks. By the 1st century CE, The peninsula was no longer a collection of tribal communities, but a set of sophisticated polities, each with its military, administrative, and cultural systems. These early developments laid the foundations for Korean identity, hierarchical yet flexible, deeply ritualistic yet pragmatic, and resilient under external pressures. The patterns of governance, defense, and cultural integration established during the Gojoseon, Bronze Age, and tribal federation periods would echo through history, informing the rise of Goryeo, Juche, and Silla, and eventually shaping the northern regions that would become North Korea. The story of the Land of Morning Calm is not just the story of territory. It is the story of adaptation, survival, and innovation. It is a history of people responding to geography, climate, neighbors, and ideas, creating societies that could endure for centuries. These early centuries of Korean civilization established the cultural DNA of the peninsula, a blend of resilience, hierarchy, ritual, and adaptability that remains discernible even in modern North Korea. Understanding this period is crucial. It frames the later conflicts, ideologies, and dynastic rule not as isolated phenomena, but as the result of millennia of social, cultural, and political evolution. By the 7th century CE, the Korean peninsula had evolved into a complex network of kingdoms, each shaped by centuries of warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Among them, Silla, located in the southeastern mountainous region, had risen to prominence not merely through conquest but through strategic alliances. In 660 CE, with crucial support from the Tang dynasty of China, Silla defeated the rival kingdom of Juche, incorporating its territories and population. This alliance was both a military necessity and a diplomatic achievement, signaling the peninsula's increasing entanglement with East Asia's larger political currents. Just 11 years later, in 668 CE, Silla finally defeated Goryeo, the northern superpower, with Tang assistance. For the first time, much of the Korean peninsula was united under a single political authority, a monumental achievement that would define the trajectory of Korean civilization. This period, often called the Unified Silla Era, 668 to 935 CE, was marked not only by political consolidation but also by cultural and intellectual flourishing. Silla's rulers implemented a highly centralized system of governance, drawing inspiration from Chinese models while preserving uniquely Korean elements. Confucianism became increasingly influential, shaping social structures, legal codes, and educational institutions. The civil service examination system, introduced in rudimentary form, allowed the selection of officials based on merit rather than mere hereditary status. Buddhism, introduced centuries earlier, became deeply entwined with the state, influencing art, architecture, and philosophy. Temples such as Wangyangsa and Gyeongju became centers of learning, religious devotion, and political authority. Under this framework, the Korean identity, hierarchical, ritualistic, and literate, began to crystallize, laying a foundation that would persist for centuries. Yet, unified Silla was not without its challenges. Internal dissent, regional rebellions, and the lingering presence of Tang forces in former Goryeo and Juche territories tested the kingdom's cohesion. Moreover, the northern border remained contested, with Goguryeo's former territories gradually absorbed by rising powers in Manchuria and northern Korea, such as the Balhae Kingdom, 698 to 926 CE. Balhae, founded by former Goryeo elites under King Dae-joyeon, claimed the legacy of Goryeo in the north, representing a continuation of northern Korean political and cultural traditions. Balhae's existence alongside Silla illustrates a duality on the peninsula. While the south experienced centralized governance and Confucian cultural refinement, the north maintained martial traditions and frontier resilience, a pattern that echoes into modern North Korean narratives about the north as the bastion of Korean endurance, and sovereignty. Following the decline of Silla in the late 9th century, Korea entered a period of fragmentation. Regional warlords, aristocratic clans, and military leaders jockeyed for control, creating conditions ripe for the rise of a new dynasty. It was in 918 CE that Wang Jian, a former general from the northeastern Goryeo territories, founded the Goryeo dynasty, 918 to 1392 CE, from which the modern name Korea derives. Goryeo's establishment marked a deliberate effort to unify the peninsula once again, drawing upon the cultural and political precedents set by Silla while asserting a distinct northern influence. Its rulers consciously sought legitimacy by invoking Goryeo heritage, reinforcing the idea that Northern Korean identity was central to the nation's history. Goryeo implemented a highly centralized administrative system. The king, supported by a bureaucracy trained in Confucian principles, wielded authority over taxation, law, and military matters. Civil service examinations became more formalized, emphasizing literacy, moral conduct, and governance skills, ensuring that officials were competent and ideologically aligned with the state. Military affairs were equally important. Goryeo faced repeated invasions from Khitan, Jurchen, and Mongol forces, necessitating the maintenance of a robust army and fortified northern borders. The dynasty's success in repelling or negotiating with these invaders contributed to a sense of northern resilience and strategic acumen, characteristics later celebrated in North Korean historiography. Culturally, Goryeo flourished. The dynasty is renowned for its celadon pottery, characterized by delicate inlays, subtle glazes, and refined aesthetic balance. Buddhist art and architecture reached unprecedented heights, reflecting both spiritual devotion and political ideology. Temples became not only religious centers, but also hubs of learning and record-keeping. Tripitaka Koreana, the comprehensive woodblock edition of Buddhist scriptures completed in 1251 CE, stands as a testament to Goryeo's scholarly, religious, and artistic achievements. This monumental work, carved with precision and maintained with meticulous care, symbolizes the dynasty's dedication to cultural preservation, a value deeply embedded in Korean consciousness. The Goryeo dynasty also navigated foreign relations with care. It maintained tributary relations with successive Chinese dynasties, including the Song and Yuan, while carefully preserving autonomy. Trade and diplomacy extended to Japan and Southeast Asia, facilitating exchanges in ceramics, textiles, and knowledge. This period demonstrates the peninsula's dual strategy of engagement and defense, outward-looking enough to gain benefits from neighboring powers, yet inwardly cohesive to withstand domination, a principle that resonates in the strategic thinking of later North Korean statecraft. By the late 14th century, internal strife, corruption, and factionalism weakened Goryeo. In 1392, Lee Song-ji-hwai, a military leader who rose to prominence in northern territories, established the Joseon dynasty, 1392 to 1897 CE, marking a new epoch in Korean history. Joseon represented both continuity and transformation. Confucianism became the guiding principle of governance, morality, and social order, supplanting Buddhism as the central ideological framework. The dynasty codified laws, educational systems, and family hierarchies in accordance with Confucian ideals. Kings were portrayed as moral exemplars whose duty was to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and people, a concept that reinforced social stability and centralized authority. Administrative divisions established under Joseon mirrored patterns from Goryeo and even earlier kingdoms, particularly in northern regions. The northern provinces, including Pyongan and Hamgyong, were recognized as strategic borderlands, fortified and patrolled to repel external incursions. Military garrisons and fortifications reflected centuries of northern martial tradition, which became both a practical necessity and a source of cultural pride. Confucianism, while dominant, coexisted with folk practices and shamanistic rituals, producing a syncretic culture capable of both intellectual sophistication and popular resilience. Joseon also emphasized scholarship and literacy. The dynasty established seowon, private academies, and national schools to train officials in Confucian classics, law, and administration. The invention of Hangul in 1443 by King Sejong the Great revolutionized literacy, enabling broader access to knowledge beyond the aristocracy. While Hangul was more widely adopted in the South initially, its creation reflects a long-standing commitment to cultural innovation and statecraft values that resonate with Northern educational and ideological traditions. Economically, Joseon managed agrarian production, taxation, and land management with remarkable sophistication. Systems like the Jong-il, land allotment, and taxation based on crop yield were designed to ensure stability and predictability, even amid natural disasters. Trade with China and Japan continued under strict regulation, enabling the flow of goods and ideas while maintaining sovereignty. Urban centers, markets, and port towns grew steadily, although northern regions remained more militarized and strategically oriented, preserving the legacy of Goryeo and Goryeo fortifications. Throughout the Joseon period, the peninsula maintained a cautious stance toward foreign powers. Known to outsiders as the Hermit Kingdom, Joseon pursued deliberate isolation, selectively engaging with China, Japan, and occasional Western emissaries while limiting external influence. This policy preserved cultural continuity and reinforced the moral and social order, but it also contributed to technological stagnation relative to rapidly industrializing neighbors. Yet the values instilled during this era, hierarchy, loyalty, resilience, and state-centered ideology, formed a substrate that would later underpin the political culture of the Northern Korean territories under modern regimes. By the end of the Joseon dynasty in the late 19th century, Northern Korea had already accumulated centuries of military, administrative, and cultural experience. Its geography, combined with historical patterns of resistance and adaptation, established the region as a core of strategic importance. These centuries of dynastic governance did more than consolidate territory. They transmitted ideas, institutions, and cultural memory. Concepts of hierarchy, Confucian morality, family loyalty, and martial vigilance became deeply ingrained, influencing societal behavior, governance models, and regional identity, a heritage that would resonate centuries later in the formation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The story of the Korean peninsula from unified Silla through Goryeo and Joseon is not merely a chronological record of dynasties. It is a tale of cultural resilience, ideological experimentation, and strategic adaptation. Northern territories, particularly those encompassing present-day North Korea, played pivotal roles in this historical arc. Military innovation, bureaucratic sophistication, and cultural production created a legacy that informed both regional identity and the later political structures imposed in the 20th century. Understanding this period is crucial. It frames North Korea not as a sudden or isolated phenomenon, but as the continuation of centuries of social, political, and cultural evolution, an inheritance of strategy, resilience, and cohesion that shaped the northern half of the peninsula for millennia. For centuries, the Joseon dynasty, 1392 to 1897, maintained a delicate balance between internal order and external isolation. Its Confucian bureaucratic system, codified laws, and hierarchical social structures allowed it to endure as a stable state in East Asia, while its careful foreign policy, often described as isolationist, earned it the moniker of the Hermit Kingdom. Yet the 19th century brought unprecedented pressure that would unravel this delicate equilibrium, exposing the vulnerabilities of a kingdom that had long relied on geography and tradition to protect its sovereignty. At the beginning of the 1800s, Joseon was still predominantly agrarian, with a population concentrated in rural villages. The state's economy relied on rice cultivation, supplemented by barley, millet, and other crops adapted to Korea's mountainous terrain. Land was divided among the Yongban aristocracy, the commoners, and the state, with strict taxation rules enforced by local magistrates. Despite centuries of stability, internal tensions simmered beneath the surface. Corruption among officials, rigid social hierarchies, and widespread peasant hardship created fault lines that would weaken Joseon when faced with external challenges. The first major foreign pressure came in the form of Western powers seeking trade, missionaries, and influence. Catholic missionaries, arriving in the late 18th century, found converts among the literate and elite classes. However, the Joseon court viewed these foreign religions as threats to Confucian moral order and social hierarchy. In 1801, the Catholic persecution under Crown Prince Haemyeong led to the execution of hundreds of converts, demonstrating the dynasty's commitment to maintaining ideological control. This tension between foreign influence and internal orthodoxy would only intensify as the century progressed. By the mid-19th century, the global geopolitical landscape was transforming rapidly. Western imperial powers expanded across Asia, demanding trade and diplomatic access. In 1846, American Protestant missionaries arrived in China, eventually seeking entry into Korea, and in 1854, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States pressured Japan to open its ports, indirectly signaling the reach of Western expansion in East Asia. Korea, geographically isolated but strategically located between China, Japan, and Russia, became increasingly vulnerable to these regional pressures. Japan, in particular, emerged as a significant threat. After its Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan rapidly modernized its military, economy, and administration, adopting Western technologies and institutional reforms. Korea, still under traditional Confucian governance, appeared stagnant in comparison. Japanese diplomats and military advisors sought to assert influence, particularly over northern regions, where strategic ports and borderlands connected to Manchuria were of immense interest. Meanwhile, China, under the Qing dynasty, continued to exert a tributary relationship over Joseon. While this relationship provided nominal protection, it also limited Joseon's diplomatic autonomy. The Imo Incident of 1882, a violent rebellion by Korean soldiers and officials dissatisfied with military reforms and Chinese influence, exemplified internal instability and exposed the dynasty's vulnerability. Though the revolt was suppressed with Qing assistance, it marked a turning point. The Joseon state could no longer rely solely on traditional hierarchies or foreign allegiances to maintain stability. Internally, peasant uprisings became increasingly common. Between 1811 and 1812, the Hongzhongrui Rebellion erupted in the northern provinces, fueled by discontent over heavy taxation, corrupt officials, and famine. The revolt involved tens of thousands of peasants, demonstrating both the capacity for popular resistance and the limitations of Joseon's bureaucratic control. In response, the government intensified military garrisons, particularly in northern regions such as Pyongyang and Hamgyong, which were historically more militarized due to their proximity to China and Manchuria. These northern defensive patterns would later influence the region's strategic significance in the 20th century. Recognizing the necessity of modernization, Joseon attempted limited reforms in the mid-19th century. King Gojong, R. 1863 to 1907, increasingly aware of the threats posed by Western powers in Japan, initiated policies to strengthen the military and economy. Western-style rifles and artillery were introduced, modern ships constructed, and telegraph systems considered. Yet these reforms were piecemeal, resisted by conservative factions, and insufficient to counteract the scale of external pressure. The dynasty's caution reflected both Confucian ideals of continuity and a fear of destabilizing the social hierarchy that had preserved its legitimacy for centuries. The critical turning point came with the Korean Empire, 1897 to 1910, established by King Gojong, who declared himself emperor in response to Japanese encroachment and Chinese weakness following the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. The war had pitted Qing China against Meiji Japan over influence in Korea, with Japan emerging victorious. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, 1895, effectively removed China's influence from the peninsula, leaving Korea exposed. In response, Emperor Gojong proclaimed the Korean Empire in 1897, seeking to assert sovereignty and modernize administration, military, and infrastructure. Reforms included reorganizing ministries, modernizing the army, and developing a postal system. However, Japan's growing power and proximity rendered these efforts largely symbolic. In parallel, Korea faced Russian encroachment. Russia sought influence in northern Korea and Manchuria, aiming for warm water ports and access to strategic resources. The resulting tension among China, Japan, and Russia transformed the peninsula into a geopolitical chessboard. While Korea attempted to navigate between these powers, its internal weaknesses, inefficient administration, factionalism, and economic strain prevented it from asserting independent control. By the early 20th century, these pressures culminated in Japan's formal annexation of Korea in 1910. But the seeds of division and ideological ferment were sown in the 19th century. The experience of foreign intrusion, domestic instability, and failed modernization created fertile ground for resistance movements, both nationalist and revolutionary. Northern regions, historically fortified and militarily oriented due to Goryeo and Goryeo legacies, became the cradle for organized resistance against Japanese influence, exemplified by figures such as Kim Il-sung, who would later emerge as the architect of North Korea's ideological state. The 19th century also reshaped Korea socially and economically. Traditional agrarian systems struggled under population pressure, climatic challenges, and taxation burdens. Crop failures and famine were recurrent, particularly in northern and inland provinces. Market towns expanded, informal trade networks developed, and smuggling along northern borders became more common. These conditions fostered resilience, improvisation, and local autonomy among the populace, traits that would later characterize both civilian and revolutionary life in North Korea. Culturally, the 19th century was a period of tension between tradition and exposure to external ideas. Confucianism remained the dominant ideology, influencing law, education, and social relations. Yet Buddhism, Christianity, and Western ideas entered the peninsula through missionaries, trade, and exile networks. Korean intellectuals debated modernization, foreign engagement, and reform, foreshadowing the ideological ferment that would define the peninsula in the 20th century. By the turn of the century, Korea, especially its northern regions, stood at a crossroads. Geography, history, and demography had created a society deeply tied to tradition yet vulnerable to external shocks. Northern fortresses, rugged terrain, and historical martial culture meant that resistance would emerge most forcefully here, even as political and economic centers shifted south. The peninsula's centuries-old isolation had preserved cultural identity, but left it unprepared for the industrial and imperial transformations sweeping the globe. In essence, the 19th century represents the final era of the Hermit Kingdom, a time when centuries of Confucian order, centralized governance, and cultural cohesion met the relentless forces of imperialism, modernization, and ideological conflict. The northern regions of Korea, inheriting a legacy of Goryeo resilience, Balhae continuity, and Goryeo fortification, became the stage where the tensions between tradition and modernity sovereignty, and foreign domination would play out in the decades to come. These centuries of preparation, constraint, and adaptation directly influenced the ideological, military, and cultural characteristics that would later define the formation of North Korea in the mid-20th century. By examining this period, one sees how internal vulnerabilities, external pressures, and northern strategic importance combined to create a crucible of resistance, reform, and eventual division. The story of 19th century Korea is thus not only about a kingdom confronted by foreign powers, but also about a society at the brink of transformation, one that would carry its centuries of martial tradition, bureaucratic rigor, and cultural identity into the ideological battles of the 20th century. The dawn of the 20th century marked the end of Korea's long-standing sovereignty and the beginning of a period of unprecedented foreign domination. The Korean Empire, 1897 to 1910, established by Emperor Gojong in an effort to modernize and assert independence, proved fragile in the face of an ascendant Japan, itself transformed by the rapid industrialization and militarization of the Meiji Restoration, 1868. By 1910, Korea, after centuries of maintaining relative isolation and careful diplomacy, found itself formally annexed by the Empire of Japan, entering a 35-year period of colonial rule that would leave indelible scars on its people, culture, and political identity. The path to annexation was neither sudden nor uncontested. Japan's growing influence over Korea began in the late 19th century, following its victory in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. The war, fought over control and influence in Korea, resulted in the Treaty of Shimonoseki, 1895, which stripped China of its suzerainty over the peninsula. Japan's victory not only demonstrated its military prowess, but also marked the beginning of Korea's subjugation to foreign powers. Internally, Korea's attempts at reform, military modernization, industrial initiatives, and administrative restructuring were insufficient to withstand Japan's strategic ambitions, partly due to entrenched conservative factions within the court that resisted rapid change. Following the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, Japan solidified its dominance over Korea. The Treaty of Portsmouth, 1905, recognized Japan's paramount interest in Korea, effectively ending Russian influence and leaving the peninsula vulnerable to complete annexation. Korea became a protectorate in 1905, and Japan began to impose direct control over administration, finance, and military affairs. By August 22, 1910, the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty formally integrated Korea into the Japanese Empire, bringing the peninsula under centralized colonial governance. This moment was catastrophic for Korean sovereignty, yet it set the stage for both widespread repression and the emergence of resistance movements that would shape Korea's 20th century history. Under Japanese rule, the colonial administration sought to assimilate Koreans culturally, economically, and politically. Korean language education was suppressed, traditional schools were restructured, and Japanese textbooks were introduced to instill loyalty to the emperor. Newspapers and other media were heavily censored, while public gatherings and political activity were strictly monitored. Temples, shrines, and cultural institutions were co-opted or destroyed to eliminate traces of Korean identity. The policy of cultural assimilation, Nasenatai, aimed to erase distinct Korean customs, religion, and historical memory, forcing the population to adopt Japanese names, etiquette, and values. Economically, the Japanese regime restructured Korea to serve imperial interests. Agricultural output was redirected to feed Japan's expanding industrial cities, often at the expense of Korean farmers, leading to widespread land dispossession and peasant hardship. Industrialization was selectively introduced, primarily in mining, infrastructure, and transport sectors, designed to extract resources and integrate Korea into Japan's war economy. Northern Korea, with its mineral wealth and proximity to Manchuria, became a key industrial and military zone, further emphasizing its strategic importance, a factor that would later influence post-liberation political geography. Forced labor and conscription into Japanese projects became commonplace, creating enduring resentment and hardship among the population. Resistance to Japanese rule emerged almost immediately. Koreans organized underground movements, secret societies, and exile governments to challenge the occupiers. Notable among these was the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea, established in Shanghai in 1919 following the suppression of domestic uprisings. This government coordinated diplomatic efforts, propaganda, and resistance activities, though it lacked military capability within the peninsula itself. The March 1st movement, Samil movement, of 1919, sparked by widespread outrage at Japanese repression, and inspired by global movements for self-determination after World War I, mobilized millions of Koreans in peaceful demonstrations. Japanese forces responded with brutal suppression, killing thousands and imprisoning tens of thousands. Despite its failure to achieve immediate independence, the movement galvanized Korean nationalism and sowed the seeds for future revolutionary leadership, particularly among communist and socialist cadres in northern Korea. The northern provinces of Korea became especially significant as centers of armed resistance. The rugged terrain of Hamgyong and Pyongan provinces, historically fortified during the Goryeo and Goryeo eras, provided shelter for guerrilla groups operating from remote mountainous regions and across the border in Manchuria. Among these resistance fighters was Kim Il-sung, who, as a teenager in the 1930s, became actively involved in anti-Japanese guerrilla operations in the forests of Manchuria. These formative experiences fighting under harsh conditions, witnessing Japanese atrocities, and operating within clandestine networks shaped the revolutionary ideology that would later underpin the foundation of North Korea. During the colonial period, the Japanese regime also manipulated ethnic and political divisions to consolidate control. Elite Koreans were co-opted into administrative roles or offered economic incentives to ensure loyalty, while ordinary citizens faced surveillance, censorship, and coercion. Educational institutions, particularly in the North, were dual-purpose, teaching basic literacy while instilling loyalty to the emperor. This manipulation of social structures reinforced hierarchical control and created long-term consequences for governance patterns, ideological indoctrination, and class divisions, elements that re-emerged in the political culture of post-liberation North Korea. Despite repression, Koreans sought to preserve and adapt their culture. Secret schools taught Korean history and language. Traditional art forms persisted in private, and oral histories maintained collective memory. Buddhism and shamanism, though restricted, remained vital in rural communities, while Christian missionaries provided alternative education and avenues for political thought. These cultural continuities, though suppressed, allowed Koreans to maintain a distinct identity under colonial pressures, preserving the foundation for future nationalist and socialist movements. The economic consequences of Japanese colonization were profound. Land surveys conducted in the 1910s and 1920s often resulted in widespread dispossession, with traditional farmers losing land to Japanese corporations or compliant local elites. Industrial development, concentrated in northern regions, created a labor force exposed to harsh working conditions in mines, factories, and transport hubs. Infrastructure projects, railways, ports, and telegraphs were primarily designed for resource extraction and troop movement, but they inadvertently facilitated post-colonial economic modernization. Urban centers in northern Korea, such as Pyongyang and Chongjin, expanded during this period, laying the groundwork for future industrial hubs under North Korean rule. By the 1930s and 1940s, Japanese rule had transformed Korea into an integrated colony, heavily mobilized for Japan's imperial ambitions. Koreans were drafted into labor for military production, conscripted into the armed forces, and subjected to propaganda promoting loyalty to the emperor. Education, media, and cultural life were entirely subordinated to the imperial agenda. For Northern Koreans, the experience of industrial labor, militarization, and guerrilla resistance created a distinctive regional identity, combining endurance, strategic awareness, and ideological ferment, a crucible that would inform the revolutionary leadership emerging after liberation. World events further shaped Korea's colonial experience. Japan's involvement in World War II intensified mobilization as labor conscription, resource extraction, and militarization increased. By the early 1940s, Korea was fully integrated into Japan's war economy. Northern industrial centers became critical for supplying iron, coal, and machinery, while guerrilla networks continued to resist, often in cooperation with Chinese Communist forces. The hardships endured during this period, famine, forced labor, and military conscription, deepened social divisions, but also hardened nationalist and socialist movements that envisioned an independent Korea. By 1945, Japan's defeat in World War II brought the formal end of colonial rule, but the legacies of occupation were profound and enduring. Korean society had been reshaped economically, socially, and politically. Industrial hubs in the north, the experience of guerrilla warfare, and the ideological training of activists such as Kim Il-sung provided the infrastructure, both human and material, for the establishment of a separate northern state. Meanwhile, Southern Korea, with its distinct colonial experiences and urban development, would follow a divergent path, setting the stage for the peninsula's eventual division. The Japanese colonial period left scars beyond politics and the economy. Cultural suppression, forced assimilation, and brutality created collective trauma that would influence Korean identity for generations. Memory of occupation was central to post-liberation ideology. Narratives of resistance, martyrdom, and revolutionary heroism became pillars of North Korean historiography. Kim Il-sung's guerrilla activities in Manchuria and the northern Korean provinces were elevated as emblematic of national resilience, linking centuries of northern martial and administrative traditions to the new socialist state. In sum, the period of Japanese colonization, 1910 to 1945, was more than mere subjugation. It was a transformative era in which Korean society endured repression, adapted to external pressures, and cultivated the seeds of resistance. North Korea's geography, industrial potential, and martial heritage made it a focal point for both colonial exploitation and revolutionary activity. By understanding this era in detail, one sees how the foundations of the modern North Korean state, its ideology, leadership, and social structure were forged in the crucible of colonization, preparing the ground for the seismic political changes that would follow in the mid-20th century. The collapse of the Japanese Empire in August 1945 marked the end of 35 years of colonial rule over Korea, but it did not bring immediate freedom or unity. Instead, the peninsula entered a period of liberation shadowed by division, shaped as much by global geopolitics as by local political movements. The surrender of Japan to the Allied forces on August 15, 1945, signaled the end of World War II and, in principle, Korea's independence. Yet the realities on the ground were far more complex. Korea had no pre-existing centralized government prepared to assume full sovereignty, and the country quickly became a strategic pawn in the emerging Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The division of Korea was hastily decided at an international level, with minimal consultation of Koreans themselves. On August 10, 1945, U.S. officials proposed the 38th parallel as a dividing line to the Soviets, ostensibly to prevent the entire peninsula from falling under Soviet occupation. This arbitrary boundary, chosen for expedience rather than historical, cultural, or strategic rationale, would have profound consequences. Soviet forces entered the northern half of Korea in late August 1945, quickly establishing military administration. American forces landed in the south in September, meeting minimal resistance due to the Japanese surrender and local exhaustion. From the outset, Korea was a land under two foreign militaries, with competing political ideologies shaping governance and society. In the north, Soviet forces encountered a population deeply affected by colonial occupation. The northern provinces had experienced both heavy industrialization under Japanese rule and concentrated guerrilla resistance in Manchuria. Among the local leaders who would gain Soviet attention was Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla commander with revolutionary credentials and communist affiliations. Soviet authorities, seeking a compliant administration sympathetic to socialist ideology, identified Kim as an ideal candidate to lead the North. By October 1945, Kim Il-sung had returned from exile in the Soviet Union and began consolidating power through the formation of the Provisional People's Committee for North Korea, laying the foundations for a centralized, Soviet-style administration. The Northern administration implemented sweeping reforms designed to reshape society along socialist lines. Land reforms were a central priority. In March 1946, the government confiscated land from Japanese collaborators and large landlords, redistributing it to poor farmers and smallholders. These reforms were politically motivated, aimed at undermining traditional elites while consolidating support among the rural population. Nationalization of key industries, banks, and infrastructure followed, reflecting the influence of Marxist-Leninist principles imported from the Soviet Union. Educational and cultural institutions were reorganized to promote literacy, political indoctrination, and loyalty to the emerging socialist state. In the South, American forces faced a very different situation. Southern Korea, more urbanized and economically diverse, had a mix of political factions ranging from conservative nationalists to communists. American occupation authorities, initially under the United States Army military government in Korea, Uzamjuk, prioritized stability and containment of leftist elements. Syngman Rhee, a longtime Korean nationalist and anti-communist with extensive experience abroad, returned from exile to become a central figure in the South. Under U.S. supervision, a provisional government was established, emphasizing democratic principles and capitalist development. Though local governance remained constrained by occupation authority and internal political divisions, the ideological rift between North and South quickly hardened. In the North, the Soviet-backed administration pushed for one-party socialist governance, while in the South, U.S. authorities encouraged democratic elections and the development of a capitalist economy. Local political organizations formed along these lines. The Workers' Party of North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, consolidated leftist groups, while Southern organizations such as the Korean Democratic Party and various nationalist groups sought influence in the South. Attempts at reconciliation or national unity were repeatedly undermined by mutual suspicion, ideological rigidity, and the interventions of the occupying powers. International dynamics exacerbated these tensions. The Yalta Conference, February 1945, and subsequent agreements among the Allied powers had emphasized post-war stability and reconstruction, yet they did not provide a clear framework for Korea's self-determination. The Soviet Union, having occupied the North, aimed to establish a friendly socialist state on its border, partly as a buffer against potential Japanese resurgence and partly to project influence in East Asia. The United States, wary of communist expansion, supported the Southern government and sought to establish Korea as a stable, non-communist ally in the Pacific. This early division mirrored the emerging bipolar global order, with Korea becoming one of the first theaters of the Cold War. Domestic unrest further complicated the situation. In both the North and South, Koreans experienced severe social dislocation after decades of Japanese rule. Northern industrial workers and peasants adapted to Soviet-style reforms, while Southern citizens contended with unemployment, inflation, and food shortages. In rural areas, grassroots movements, labor unions, and local militias emerged, reflecting both popular aspirations for reform and the enduring influence of wartime resistance networks. Violence and political suppression were common, as competing factions sought to assert control in an environment of uncertainty. By 1947, the division of Korea had become institutionalized. The United Nations became involved, conducting inspections and attempting to facilitate elections across the entire peninsula. However, the Soviet Union refused to permit UN access to the north, while the United States advanced plans for elections in the south. The result was a geopolitically and ideologically entrenched division, with two separate Korean governments emerging as parallel authorities rather than components of a single national administration. The culmination of this process occurred in 1948. On August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea, ROK, was formally established in the South, with Syngman Rhee inaugurated as president. In the North, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was declared on September 9, 1948, with Kim Il-sung as premier. Each government claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula, and each sought international recognition. This formal division transformed what had been a historical and cultural unity into a politically bifurcated state, setting the stage for the Korean War and the persistent tensions that define the peninsula to this day. The immediate consequences of division were profound. Families were separated, social networks disrupted, and economic systems bifurcated. North Korea, under Soviet guidance, pursued rapid industrialization, collectivization, and militarization, building upon pre-existing Japanese-era infrastructure and guerrilla networks. Southern Korea, with U.S. support, focused on democratic institutions and capitalist economic structures, though political instability, corruption, and authoritarian tendencies remained significant challenges. The artificial nature of the 38th parallel drawn for expedience rather than historical logic became a permanent fault line, cementing regional identities and political allegiances in ways that continue to influence the peninsula. It is also essential to recognize the human dimension. In the North, land redistribution and social reforms generated significant support among peasants and workers, many of whom had suffered under Japanese occupation. Yet these policies also involved forced compliance, political purges, and suppression of dissent, particularly against landlords, political rivals, and religious organizations perceived as threats. In the South, rapid political changes created both hope and anxiety. Citizens faced shortages, administrative disruption, and the challenge of building governance from scratch, all under the watchful eye of foreign military occupiers. The period from 1945 to 1948, therefore, represents more than the mere transition from colonial rule to national governance. It is the era in which external powers, local leaders, and social movements converged to reshape Korea fundamentally. North Korea, with its Soviet-backed administration, prepared the infrastructure, leadership, and ideological framework that would become the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Southern Korea, shaped by U.S. influence and nationalist leadership, charted a separate path. The historical significance of this period lies in its role as the crucible in which the modern division of Korea was forged, a division that continues to define geopolitics, identity, and society on the peninsula. In hindsight, the decisions made during these 3 critical years of occupation, administration, and political consolidation were decisive. They transformed the arbitrary 38th parallel into a lasting boundary, created parallel states with opposing ideologies and established the conditions for conflict and rivalry. The legacy of Japanese colonial exploitation, Soviet and American intervention, and domestic political mobilization converged to make the Korean Peninsula one of the earliest flashpoints of the Cold War, with consequences reverberating through the 20th century and beyond. The division of Korea, solidified in 1948, laid the groundwork for an inevitable conflict. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, in the north and the Republic of Korea, ROK, in the south, each claiming legitimacy over the entire peninsula, were ideologically opposed and militarily armed. In this volatile environment, the stage was set for the Korean War, a conflict that would not only devastate the peninsula, but also mark one of the first proxy battles of the emerging Cold War. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, under the command of Kim Il-sung, launched a full-scale invasion across the 38th parallel. Equipped with Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, artillery, and infantry, the DPRK army moved swiftly, overwhelming the underprepared South Korean forces. Within days, North Korean troops captured Seoul, the capital, demonstrating both the military effectiveness of the northern forces and the vulnerabilities of the South. The invasion was meticulously planned, relying on intelligence provided by the Soviet Union and logistical support from China's northeast border, highlighting the international dimensions of the conflict from the very outset. The North's initial success prompted rapid international intervention. On June 27, 1950, the United Nations Security Council, in the absence of the Soviet Union, which was boycotting the body over the Chinese seat, passed Resolution 83, recommending member states provide military assistance to South Korea. The United States, acting under UN auspices, mobilized the United States Eighth Army, led by General Douglas MacArthur, to reinforce the southern defense. Other nations, including the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Turkey, and several others, contributed troops, forming a multinational UN coalition. This rapid internationalization transformed what might have been a regional civil conflict into a global confrontation between communist and capitalist blocs. The initial stages of the war were catastrophic for South Korea. North Korean forces captured nearly all major cities south of the 38th parallel, including Incheon, Daejeon, and Taijeon. Casualties mounted, infrastructure crumbled, and millions of civilians were displaced. Seoul fell within 3 days, forcing the South Korean government to retreat to the southern port city of Busan, where a defensive perimeter known as the Pusan Perimeter was established by August 1950. The UN forces, despite superior training and equipment, faced logistical challenges and fierce resistance from entrenched North Korean units, underscoring the ferocity of the northern advance. In a bold and decisive move, General MacArthur orchestrated the Incheon landing on September 15, 1950, a risky amphibious assault aimed at cutting North Korean supply lines and recapturing Seoul. The operation succeeded spectacularly, reversing the tide of the war. UN and South Korean forces advanced northward, reclaiming territory and eventually reaching the Yalu River, the border with China, by late October. At this point, the war seemed poised for a decisive victory for the South and its allies. However, this success provoked a dramatic intervention. Alarmed by the approach of hostile forces to its border and fearing the potential collapse of a communist neighbor, China, under Mao Zedong, entered the war in October 1950. Chinese forces, often referred to as the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and launched surprise attacks against UN forces, inflicting severe casualties and forcing a retreat. The North Korean army, bolstered by Chinese reinforcements and Soviet logistical support, regained much of the lost territory, including Pyongyang, by December 1950. The war had shifted from rapid maneuvers to brutal positional fighting. with both sides digging in for protracted engagements. The conflict from late 1950 to 1951 descended into a stalemate, characterized by grueling trench warfare, artillery duels, and high civilian casualties. Cities and towns across the peninsula were decimated by bombing campaigns and ground battles. North Korea's infrastructure, already weakened by colonial exploitation and post-liberation instability, suffered near-total destruction in major urban centers. Seoul changed hands 4 times during the war, illustrating the chaotic ebb and flow of the conflict. Meanwhile, guerrilla warfare and partisan actions continued behind front lines, particularly in northern mountainous regions, sustaining a cycle of resistance and repression. Efforts at diplomacy were intermittent and largely ineffective. Armistice negotiations began as early as July 1951 at Kaesong and later at Panmunjom, but the parties struggled to reach an agreement on critical issues such as prisoner repatriation and border demarcation. Casualties continued to mount. Estimates suggest approximately 1 million military deaths on both sides, 2 to 3 million civilian deaths, and millions more displaced, creating one of the largest humanitarian crises of the post-war era. The widespread suffering reinforced ideological narratives on both sides, with propaganda emphasizing heroism, victimhood, and the righteousness of each respective cause. The war also highlighted the strategic importance of Northern Korea. Its rugged terrain, industrial centers, and proximity to China made it a natural base for military operations and a critical theater of resistance. The northern province's historical role as a bastion against foreign invasion, dating back to Goryeo and fortified during Japanese occupation, facilitated both defense and offensive operations during the conflict. Cities such as Hamhung, Chongjin, and Pyongyang bore the brunt of sustained fighting and aerial bombardment, shaping post-war reconstruction priorities in the north. By July 27, 1953, after nearly 3 years of relentless warfare, an armistice agreement was signed at Panmunjom. The agreement effectively restored borders near the 38th parallel, although no formal peace treaty was ever concluded. The Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, was established, creating a heavily fortified buffer between North and South. This armistice formalized the division of the peninsula, leaving both Koreas deeply scarred physically, socially, and politically. Armies, militias, and civilian populations were exhausted, cities lay in ruins, and the question of national reunification remained unresolved. The Korean War had profound implications beyond the peninsula. It represented one of the first proxy conflicts of the Cold War, drawing the United States, China, and the Soviet Union into direct and indirect confrontation. It tested new military technologies, including jet aircraft and mechanized infantry, while demonstrating the dangers of ideological rigidity and international entanglement. For the North, the war reinforced the need for military preparedness, centralized control, and political loyalty, shaping the strategies and governance structures that would dominate the DPRK in subsequent decades. For the civilian population, particularly in the north, the war created enduring hardship. Food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and displacement forced Koreans to adapt through resilience, improvisation, and reliance on local networks. The psychological and social impact of mass destruction and loss of life influenced collective memory and political culture, reinforcing narratives of external threat, national resilience, and the legitimacy of centralized, authoritarian governance. The war also solidified the leadership of Kim Il-sung. His role in organizing defenses, coordinating with Chinese allies, and post-war reconstruction efforts elevated him as the eternal leader in Northern historiography. By emphasizing both military victory or survival and ideological consolidation, Kim was able to strengthen the foundation of the DPRK, embedding the principles of Juche, self-reliance, and the centrality of the military in society, principles that would guide North Korean policy for decades. By the time hostilities ended, the Korean peninsula was profoundly transformed. Urban centers in the north had been rebuilt along socialist lines, industrial infrastructure reoriented for state control, and political institutions centralized under Kim Il-sung and the Workers' Party of Korea. The South, under Syngman Rhee, pursued reconstruction, democratic institutions, and alignment with Western powers. Yet the division was now permanent in practice, if not legally formalized, and the war's legacy continued to define military posture, ideological indoctrination, and international relations on both sides. The Korean War, thus, stands as a pivotal moment in modern Korean history. It was a conflict rooted in historical grievances, colonial legacies, and Cold War geopolitics, fought by millions with catastrophic human cost. For the North, it was both a crucible and a foundation, a war that tested the nascent state, reinforced ideological cohesion, and created the conditions for Kim Il-sung's consolidation of power. The scars of the conflict remain etched into the peninsula's landscape, society, and collective memory, and the war's unresolved status continues to shape geopolitical tensions to this day. In the wake of the Korean War, North Korea emerged as a nation profoundly shaped by conflict, ideology, and the leadership of one man, Kim Il-sung. Born in 1912 in Mangyongdae, near Pyongyang, Kim's early life was marked by Japanese colonial repression and participation in anti-Japanese guerrilla movements in Manchuria during the 1930s and 1940s. His experience as a revolutionary fighter profoundly shaped his vision for Korea, a nation unified under socialist principles, militarily strong, and ideologically coherent. By September 9, 1948, with the formal establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, Kim Il-sung was appointed premier, assuming the leadership role that he would hold for nearly half a century. Kim's early administration focused on consolidating power and rebuilding a nation devastated by war. The Korean War had left the peninsula in ruins, with much of its infrastructure destroyed, millions dead or displaced, and the economy in disarray. In response, Kim implemented centralized economic planning, modeled on Soviet-style command systems. Between 1948 and 1953, efforts were made to rebuild heavy industry, expand state-owned enterprises, and restore basic services. The northern provinces, which had been industrialized under Japanese rule, became central to these reconstruction efforts, forming the backbone of North Korea's post-war economy. Coal, steel, and textile production were prioritized, and electricity grids and transportation networks were restored under strict state control. Simultaneously, Kim Il-sung established a single-party state, merging nationalist and communist rhetoric under the Korean Workers' Party, KWP. Political consolidation involved eliminating rival factions and dissenters. Purges were carried out against members of the Yenin faction, Koreans trained in China, the Soviet Korean faction, Koreans educated in the USSR, and domestic opposition figures. By the mid-1950s, Kim had effectively centralized authority around his leadership, creating a political environment in which loyalty was enforced through surveillance, party membership, and public displays of allegiance. The Juche ideology, formally articulated in the 1950s and 1960s, became the guiding principle of North Korean governance under Kim. Juche, often translated as self-reliance, emphasized political independence, economic self-sufficiency, and military readiness. While inspired by Marxist-Leninist thought, Juche uniquely adapted socialist principles to the Korean historical and cultural contexts. It stressed national sovereignty, the primacy of the leader, and the centrality of the masses as a mobilizable workforce. This ideology permeated every aspect of life, from education to media, and became a tool for both internal cohesion and external diplomacy. Education and propaganda were central to Kim's consolidation of power. From the 1950s onward, schools, universities, and youth organizations emphasized loyalty to the leader, historical narratives of resistance against Japanese colonialism, and the virtues of socialist work. Textbooks glorified Kim's guerrilla exploits and framed the DPRK as the continuation of Korea's historical struggle against foreign domination. Mass rallies, public performances, and national celebrations reinforced ideological unity, creating a populace steeped in loyalty, discipline, and revolutionary narrative. By the 1970s, the cult of personality around Kim Il-sung had become a defining feature of North Korean society, with his image and rhetoric omnipresent in every public space. The economy under Kim saw significant early successes, particularly compared to South Korea in the immediate post-war years. Industrial production increased, literacy rates improved, and the state achieved near-universal healthcare coverage. By the 1960s, North Korea had established itself as one of the most industrialized countries in East Asia. However, this growth came at the cost of centralization, lack of market flexibility, and heavy dependence on Soviet and Chinese aid. Policies favoring heavy industry over agriculture led to periodic food shortages, which would later become critical during the 1990s. Nevertheless, in this period, North Korea presented itself as a model socialist state, self-contained, industrious, and ideologically coherent. International relations during Kim's early rule were defined by alignment with the Soviet Union and China, though he skillfully navigated between the two to assert autonomy. In the 1960s, Kim pursued a policy of relative independence, at times criticizing Soviet and Chinese approaches while asserting North Korea's right to determine its own path. This stance strengthened the Juche ideology and enhanced Kim's legitimacy as a leader capable of safeguarding Korean sovereignty. North Korea also extended its influence abroad, supporting revolutionary movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, projecting itself as a champion of anti-imperialist struggle and aligning with global socialist networks. The 1970s and 1980s marked both consolidation and increasing isolation. Kim Il-sung formalized dynastic succession, preparing his son, Kim Jong-il, to inherit leadership, a rare move in socialist states. Economic difficulties, stemming from rigid central planning and declining aid from the Soviet Union, began to emerge. While heavy industry and military production remained priorities, consumer goods were scarce, and agricultural inefficiencies were increasingly apparent. Nevertheless, the regime maintained social stability through strict control over movement, information, and political participation. Propaganda reinforced the narrative of North Korea as a fortress resisting external threats, particularly from the United States and South Korea. Military development was a cornerstone of Kim's rule. Following the Korean War, the DPRK maintained a large standing army, eventually formalizing the military-first, Sungun, philosophy under his son, though its roots lay in Kim Il-sung's policies. Defense against perceived imperialist threats justified resource allocation to the military and border fortifications, including extensive defenses along the DMZ, were constructed. The military also served as a social and political institution, reinforcing loyalty and providing employment, while instilling a culture of readiness that would define the nation for decades. Cultural and social life under Kim was tightly controlled, but it also reflected a distinct northern identity shaped by history, war, and ideology. Traditional Korean rituals, arts, and folklore were co-opted to fit the revolutionary narrative. Public performances, mass games, and parades celebrated both historical Korean heritage and contemporary socialist achievements. Religion, particularly Christianity and Buddhism, was suppressed or tightly monitored, while state-sanctioned rituals emphasized loyalty to the leader and the socialist state. This fusion of historical memory and ideological indoctrination created a uniquely North Korean cultural milieu, distinct from both South Korea and the former colonial experience under Japan. By the 1980s, Kim Il-sung had solidified a near-totalitarian state. Purges of political opponents, surveillance through state security organs, and propaganda reinforced his personal authority. The cult of personality was unprecedented. Every citizen was aware of Kim's narrative of heroism, struggle, and infallibility. Statues, portraits, and monuments dotted the landscape, and educational curricula glorified his achievements and the historical legitimacy of the regime. Kim Il-sung's leadership was framed as the embodiment of Korean resistance, self-reliance, and revolutionary spirit, a narrative that would endure even after his death. The latter years of Kim's rule saw challenges arising from global change. The decline of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s threatened North Korea's economic support, though this crisis would fully materialize only after Kim died in 1994. Meanwhile, international diplomatic pressures, the evolving South Korean economy, and shifts in East Asian geopolitics created a complex environment. Kim navigated these changes by emphasizing internal cohesion, ideological purity, and selective engagement with foreign powers, ensuring that the DPRK remained politically and militarily stable despite emerging vulnerabilities. Kim Il-sung passed away on July 8, 1994, leaving a state meticulously structured around his leadership, ideology, and personal authority. His nearly 46-year rule transformed North Korea from a war-ravaged nation into a centralized, militarized, and ideologically cohesive state. Juche and the cult of personality remained central to governance, while dynastic succession ensured continuity under his son, Kim Jong-il. The legacy of his rule extended beyond governance. It shaped North Korea's economic strategies, cultural identity, military posture, and relations with the outside world, creating a distinct state unlike any other in the contemporary international system. The historical significance of Kim Il-sung's rule is multifaceted. On one hand, he rebuilt a nation devastated by war, established governance structures, and fostered a distinct national identity rooted in ideology and resistance. On the other hand, his policies entrenched authoritarianism, suppressed dissent, and created economic and social rigidities that would challenge subsequent leadership. Understanding Kim Il-sung's rule is essential to comprehending the foundations of modern North Korea, its enduring isolation, and the ideological and political frameworks that continue to influence the peninsula and the wider region. In sum, the period from 1948 to 1994 was one of remarkable transformation and consolidation. From the ashes of war, Kim Il-sung constructed a nation centered on self-reliance, loyalty, and military strength. He fused historical memory, revolutionary struggle, and socialist ideology into a governing narrative that legitimized his rule and prepared the state for dynastic succession. The era left a complex legacy, a resilient centralized state with a distinct identity, yet one increasingly isolated from global trends and vulnerable to structural economic and social challenges, a legacy that continues to define North Korea in the present day. The death of Kim Il-sung in July 1994 marked the end of an era and the beginning of a period of profound crisis for North Korea. While the late years of his rule had seen economic stagnation, the sudden loss of centralized leadership, combined with systemic structural weaknesses and geopolitical changes, plunged the country into what became known as the Arduous March, a famine and economic collapse that devastated the population and challenged the very survival of the state. The term Arduous March itself, evocative of historical struggles against foreign invaders, was deliberately used by the regime to frame the crisis as a collective test of endurance, resilience, and loyalty. To understand the catastrophe of the 1990s, it is essential to consider the economic and geopolitical context. North Korea's economy had been heavily dependent on the Soviet Union, both for trade and for subsidized oil, machinery, and technology. This centrally planned economy, while effective in the post-war decades for industrial and military development, lacked flexibility, diversification, and innovation. Agriculture suffered from over-centralization, state ownership of land, and mismanagement of production quotas. By the late 1980s, these structural deficiencies were compounded by environmental degradation, including deforestation and soil erosion, which reduced the land's capacity to sustain crops. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the critical external shock. With the loss of its main ally, North Korea experienced a dramatic reduction in trade, aid, and fuel supplies. Exports to the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries declined sharply, while imports of critical machinery, fertilizers, and petroleum products fell to crisis levels. This sudden economic isolation left the state unable to maintain industrial output or sustain agricultural productivity. Food shortages, which had been recurring in the 1980s, escalated into full-scale famine by 1994 to 1995. Domestic policy choices exacerbated the crisis. The regime prioritized military spending, heavy industry, and the maintenance of elite privileges over food production. Agricultural collectivization and rigid distribution systems limited efficiency, while state-controlled rationing failed to meet the needs of the population. Inadequate investment in infrastructure, such as irrigation systems and mechanized farming equipment, further hindered production. Meanwhile, natural disasters, including severe flooding in 1995 and 1996, destroyed crops and farmland, dramatically reducing harvests and triggering widespread malnutrition. The human toll of the arduous march was catastrophic. Estimates of mortality vary due to limited access and state secrecy, but scholars generally agree that between 600,000 and 1 million North Koreans died from starvation, malnutrition-related disease, and associated social collapse. Millions more suffered from chronic hunger, with rural populations particularly affected. Cities, while less directly exposed to famine than the countryside, experienced shortages of food, fuel, and necessities. The crisis created massive displacement, with many attempting to flee to China or informal internal migration in search of sustenance. The state's response to the famine combined denial, propaganda, and partial adaptation. The government attributed the crisis to foreign hostility, framing the famine as the result of U.S.-led sanctions, imperialist aggression, and natural disasters, rather than structural failures or policy mismanagement. Propaganda emphasized resilience, sacrifice, and collective struggle, invoking historical analogies to resistance against Japanese colonialism and the Korean War. The regime maintained strict control over media and information, limiting external awareness of the full scope of the famine. At the same time, the arduous march forced subtle changes in the informal economy. Markets known as jangmadang emerged as survival mechanisms, enabling farmers, traders, and ordinary citizens to bypass state rationing and obtain food and goods. These markets, initially tolerated by local officials, became a critical feature of daily life, fostering small-scale entrepreneurship and social networks outside of direct state control. Black market trade with China also expanded, as cross-border smuggling of food and fuel became essential for survival. While the state remained ideologically committed to self-reliance, these informal economies demonstrated the resilience and ingenuity of ordinary North Koreans under extreme hardship. International humanitarian organizations began to respond in the mid-1990s. The United Nations and non-governmental organizations delivered food aid to the country, but distribution was tightly controlled by the government. Aid was often politicized, directed toward politically loyal regions or elites, and closely monitored to prevent perceived ideological contamination. Despite these challenges, humanitarian assistance mitigated the worst of the famine, though it did not fully resolve structural food insecurity. The arduous march also had profound social and cultural consequences. Traditional social hierarchies, previously reinforced through the Songbun system, which categorized citizens by family background, political loyalty, and perceived reliability, were challenged as survival became a primary concern. Those with greater access to markets, cross-border networks, or urban resources often fared better than those in rural or politically marginalized communities. Informal networks of kinship, friendship, and community became critical for survival, reflecting both the fragility of centralized control under extreme stress and the adaptive strategies of the population. Politically, Kim Jong-il, who had been groomed as heir since the 1970s, began to consolidate authority during this period. While the arduous march represented a crisis for ordinary citizens, it also reinforced the regime's prioritization of military and political stability over civilian welfare. Resources were allocated preferentially to the military, party cadres, and loyal elites, reinforcing the centrality of the military-first, Sungun, policy that would dominate Kim Jong-il's rule after 1994. The famine thus shaped the trajectory of North Korea's governance, embedding patterns of resource allocation, surveillance, and ideological mobilization that persist into the 21st century. Despite the scale of suffering, the arduous march reinforced state narratives of resilience and self-reliance. Public rhetoric framed survival as a continuation of Korea's historical struggle against foreign aggression, colonialism, and occupation. Education, media, and cultural messaging emphasized moral fortitude, sacrifice, and loyalty to the leadership, ensuring that the crisis, while devastating, did not fundamentally destabilize the regime. North Korea emerged from the famine not as a weakened state, but as one whose internal cohesion and ideological structures had been tested and, in the eyes of the regime, reaffirmed. By the late 1990s, the immediate famine had largely subsided, but the country remained economically fragile. Agricultural production gradually recovered with a combination of improved management, market adaptation, and modest international aid, yet chronic food insecurity persisted. Infrastructure remained underdeveloped, energy shortages continued, and the state retained tight control over distribution and access to resources. Social inequalities, exacerbated by the Songbun system and survival during the famine, persisted, creating long-term stratification within North Korean society. The arduous march also had lasting implications for North Korea's international posture. The experience of isolation, external threats, and reliance on domestic resources reinforced the regime's commitment to Juche and the development of independent military capabilities, including eventual nuclear ambitions. The famine became a historical reference point for leadership legitimacy, used to frame the country's survival under adversity as evidence of the moral and political authority of the Kim dynasty. In sum, the 1990s arduous march was a defining moment in North Korean history. It was a period characterized by famine, social adaptation, structural economic failure, and ideological consolidation. While millions suffered and died, the state survived and even reinforced its narrative of self-reliance, military preparedness, and loyalty to leadership. The lessons of this period about the fragility of centralized economies, the resilience of social networks, and the interplay between ideology and survival continue to shape North Korea today. The arduous march remains a central historical reference in understanding how the DPRK balances extreme hardship with political continuity, and it underscores the enduring influence of the Kim dynasty in shaping national identity, governance, and survival strategy. The death of Kim Il-sung on July 8, 1994, brought a new era to North Korea. His son, Kim Jong-il, who had been groomed for decades, assumed leadership in a country still reeling from the arduous march, a famine that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and destabilized the economy. While the human cost was staggering, the political structures and ideological narratives of the DPRK remained intact, providing Kim Jong-il with both the challenge and the foundation to consolidate power. His leadership would be defined by a unique approach known as Sungun, or military-first policy, which prioritized the Korean People's Army, KPA, above all other sectors of the state and society. From the very beginning, Kim Jong-il faced significant challenges. The economy was weakened, infrastructure damaged, and international isolation intensified by the famine and nuclear ambitions. Despite these constraints, he moved quickly to assert authority over the military and the party, emphasizing loyalty and ideological orthodoxy. Purges of potential rivals, including members of the old guard, high-ranking officials, and even close family members, secured his grip on power by the late 1990s. By 1998, he had officially assumed the titles of Chairman of the National Defense Commission and General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, centralizing control over military, political, and ideological institutions. Kim Jong-il's Sungun policy, formally articulated in 1995 to 1996, reflected a strategic shift from his father's Juche-centered focus on self-reliance and civilian economic development. Sungun placed the military at the center of national priorities, providing both the defense apparatus and political elites with preferential access to resources, influence, and social status. This strategy ensured that the regime could maintain internal stability while projecting strength externally. It also justified the continued allocation of resources to weapons development and military infrastructure, even amidst economic hardship. The military-first approach had immediate implications. The KPA became the primary driver of technological development, including conventional arms, missile programs, and nuclear research. North Korea's missile program, initiated in the 1980s, accelerated under Kim Jong-il, with a focus on medium and long-range capabilities. By the late 1990s, the Taepodong, one missile test in 1998 demonstrated the regime's growing technical proficiency and signaled its ability to strike beyond the peninsula. Nuclear ambitions, though still in early stages, became a central instrument of deterrence and diplomacy. The regime's nuclear trajectory reached a pivotal moment on October 9, 2006, with North Korea's first nuclear test. Though this was beyond the period covered by 1994 to 2011, the foundations of nuclear development were laid during Kim Jong-il's leadership, including clandestine uranium enrichment programs and strategic partnerships with foreign scientists and engineers in the 1990s. These efforts were accompanied by a parallel diplomatic strategy, engaging in negotiations, brinkmanship, and limited agreements, such as the 1994 agreed framework with the United States, which promised fuel aid in exchange for freezing nuclear weapon development. The agreement, though short-lived, reflected Kim's ability to use military and technological leverage to extract concessions and maintain regime security. Economically, the post-famine period was marked by cautious adaptation and improvisation. While the state maintained centralized control, informal markets known as Jangmadang expanded in importance, allowing citizens to acquire food, fuel, and goods outside official channels. These markets became semi-tolerated by local authorities, reflecting a pragmatic acknowledgement that survival depended on flexibility within the rigid system. Cross-border trade with China grew significantly, both legally and illegally, forming a lifeline for North Korea's economy. Despite these adaptations, the majority of the population continued to live under strict rationing, with resources heavily skewed toward military and political elites. Internationally, Kim Jong-il pursued a dual strategy of isolation and engagement. While North Korea remained diplomatically insular, particularly towards South Korea and the United States, It cultivated relationships with China and Russia, securing trade, fuel, and political backing. The 1990s saw repeated inter-Korean tensions, including naval skirmishes and confrontations along the DMZ, yet occasional dialogue led to limited humanitarian aid and symbolic summits. These diplomatic maneuvers reinforced the perception of North Korea as a fortress state, capable of resisting external pressure while maintaining strategic leverage through military power. Internally, the Kim regime extended the personality cult established by his father. Kim Jong-il was portrayed as an infallible leader, a genius strategist, and the rightful heir of Kim Il-sung. Statues, portraits, and state media emphasized his role in guiding the nation through crisis and achieving military and technological milestones. Education and propaganda emphasized loyalty to both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, reinforcing intergenerational continuity and ideological cohesion. This dual cult of personality ensured that the leadership remained central to political legitimacy and social order. Social control mechanisms remained rigorous. The Songbun system continued to determine social and political status, controlling access to education, employment, and privileges. Dissent was suppressed through surveillance, detention, and public punishment. Yet, the regime also allowed limited economic improvisation through informal markets, demonstrating a pragmatic balance between ideological rigidity and practical necessity. Ordinary citizens navigated these structures with resilience, creativity, and adaptation, sustaining their communities and families while complying with the visible apparatus of state control. Kim Jong-il's North Korea also emphasized technological and scientific advancement, particularly in military and strategic sectors. Missile development, nuclear research, and conventional weapon production were prioritized, supported by imported technology and domestic innovation. These programs were framed as both defensive and ideological imperatives, reinforcing the state's sovereignty narrative and justifying the continued concentration of resources on elite institutions. By the 2000s, North Korea had emerged as a militarily capable, if economically isolated, state, capable of projecting power and negotiating on the global stage despite widespread poverty and underdevelopment. The cultural and ideological dimensions of Kim's rule were also significant. Public performances, mass games, and state ceremonies continued to glorify the leadership and the nation's historical struggles. Arts and media were tightly controlled, reflecting the regime's interpretation of Korean history, socialist principles, and military valor. Religion remained suppressed, and information from abroad was strictly limited, reinforcing the narrative of North Korea as a unique, sovereign, and ideologically pure nation. Despite chronic economic challenges, Kim Jong-il maintained internal stability. The military-first policy ensured that the armed forces remained loyal and well-provisioned. The party apparatus effectively managed political control, and propaganda reinforced social cohesion. This stability allowed the regime to survive external shocks, such as international sanctions, fluctuating aid from China, and periodic natural disasters, while preparing for dynastic succession. By December 17, 2011, Kim Jong-il's sudden death paved the way for his son, Kim Jong-un, to assume leadership, completing the transition to a third generation of the Kim dynasty. The legacy of Kim Jong-il's rule is complex. He preserved the ideological, military, and political structures established by his father, while adapting policies to ensure survival amidst unprecedented economic and humanitarian challenges. Songbun institutionalized the military as the central pillar of governance, reinforcing the state's defensive and coercive capacities. His tenure saw the foundation of North Korea's nuclear capabilities, an increasingly isolated economy tempered by pragmatic market adaptation, and an enduring cult of personality that legitimized dynastic rule. In historical terms, Kim Jong-il's leadership demonstrates the interplay between ideology, pragmatism, and survival. North Korea under his rule survived severe famine, economic collapse, and international isolation while consolidating power, advancing military programs, and maintaining social cohesion. The arduous march shaped policy priorities, informing military-first governance, the privileging of elite institutions, and pragmatic toleration of informal markets. These adaptations ensured continuity of the regime, reinforced loyalty, and preserved the nation-state despite extreme adversity. By the time of his death in December 2011, North Korea was economically fragile, militarily capable, and ideologically rigid. The state had navigated crises, maintained control over its population, and projected power internationally despite limited resources. The structures, policies, and narratives established under Kim Jong-il would guide the country into the era of Kim Jong-un, ensuring that the DPRK remained a distinctive, militarized, and resilient state in the global system. On December 17, 2011, the world learned of the death of Kim Jong-il, marking the end of a 17-year rule that had consolidated military first, Sungun, governance sustained the personality cult, and navigated North Korea through famine, economic hardship, and increasing global isolation. The mantle of leadership passed to his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, who at the time was in his late 20s or early 30s. Unlike his father and grandfather, Kim Jong-un had been largely invisible on the international stage, raising questions about his ability to command authority over the military, party, and population. Yet, within months, he demonstrated a strategic combination of ruthlessness, political acumen, and ideological continuity that would define his leadership. From the outset, Kim Jong-un moved decisively to consolidate power. One of his first actions involved purging potential rivals and dissenting elites, a hallmark of North Korean leadership transitions. In December 2013, he orchestrated the execution of Jang Song-thaek, his uncle by marriage and previously the second most powerful man in the country. Jang was accused of treason and corruption, and his removal served multiple purposes: consolidating the young leader's authority, intimidating potential opponents, and signaling the continuation of absolute loyalty to the Kim dynasty. Other purges and demotions followed in the first years of his rule, targeting senior officials, military leaders, and technocrats, ensuring that no individual could challenge his authority. Kim Jong-un inherited a country deeply shaped by his predecessors, a centralized economy weakened by international sanctions, a population accustomed to strict ideological indoctrination, and a military prioritized over civilian needs. Recognizing the importance of legitimacy, he embraced the dual cult of personality established by Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, while introducing his own image as a dynamic, youthful, and innovative leader. State media emphasized his supposed strategic genius, his care for the people, and his role as the rightful heir of the revolution, reinforcing continuity and inspiring loyalty. Monuments, murals, and portraits of the three generations of Kims became central symbols of state authority. A cornerstone of Kim Jong-un's strategy was the acceleration of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. While the foundations for nuclear development were laid under his father, Kim Jong-un transformed the program into a central pillar of both domestic legitimacy and international bargaining power. On February 12, 2013, North Korea conducted its third nuclear test, claiming it had successfully detonated a device small enough to be used on a missile. Subsequent tests in 2016 and 2017, including the sixth nuclear test in September 2017, demonstrated significant technical advances, signaling the regime's growing capabilities in both nuclear warheads and missile delivery systems. This nuclear program became central to the state's defense doctrine, deterrence strategy, and global positioning, allowing North Korea to resist diplomatic pressure while negotiating with the United States, South Korea, and China from a position of perceived strength. Missile development, closely tied to the nuclear program, accelerated dramatically under Kim Jong-un. North Korea tested a range of short-dash, medium-dash, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, between 2012 and 2017, including the Hwasong-12, Hwasong-14. Domestically, Kim Jong-un maintained strict control over society while selectively allowing limited economic adaptation. Jangmadang markets, initially tolerated under Kim Jong-il, continued to expand, providing citizens with means to supplement state rations, trade goods, and earn income. While the government monitored these markets closely, recognizing their necessity for survival, they represented a subtle shift in state-society relations, allowing for limited informal economic activity within an otherwise rigidly controlled system. Cross-border trade with China remained a vital lifeline, particularly in food, fuel, and consumer goods. Kim also pursued selective modernization of the state and infrastructure. Pyongyang and other urban centers saw the construction of high-rise apartment complexes, luxury hotels, sports facilities, and new public squares. These projects were designed to demonstrate the regime's competence, impress domestic audiences, and project power internationally. Yet, outside these showcase developments, much of the country remained underdeveloped, with rural regions and smaller cities experiencing chronic shortages of electricity, water, and basic services. This contrast highlighted both the state's priorities and the disparities inherent in a regime focused on elite and military satisfaction over widespread civilian welfare. The regime also relied on sophisticated propaganda, information control, and surveillance. State media continued to present a sanitized and heroic image of Kim Jong-un, emphasizing victories in military technology, economic projects, and diplomatic negotiations. Internet access remained tightly restricted, with foreign media banned or heavily filtered. Dissent or unauthorized contact with external information sources was punished severely, reinforcing obedience and ideological conformity. Education emphasized loyalty, history framed through the lens of national struggle, and youth programs instilled devotion to the Kim dynasty, ensuring continuity of the state's ideological foundations. International relations under Kim Jong-un have been characterized by unpredictability, strategic brinkmanship, and occasional diplomacy. Notably, inter-Korean summits in April 2018 and May 2018 with South Korean President Moon Jae-in signaled a temporary thaw in relations, accompanied by commitments to denuclearization and military de-escalation, though many of these pledges were not fully implemented. Similarly, the historic 2018 to 2019 summits with U.S. President Donald Trump, including the June 12, 2018 meeting in Singapore, demonstrated North Korea's willingness to engage in high-profile diplomacy while leveraging nuclear and missile capabilities for maximum political effect. These interactions highlighted Kim's strategic sophistication in navigating international pressure, balancing sanctions, and projecting an image of a legitimate global actor. The economy under Kim Jong-un has been shaped by both continuity and adaptation. While central planning and elite favoritism continue to dominate, the regime has tolerated certain market mechanisms, particularly in border regions and urban centers, to stabilize the population and prevent unrest. Agricultural reforms, limited private enterprise, and state-sanctioned markets have allowed the economy to function despite sanctions and chronic inefficiencies. Nevertheless, widespread poverty, food insecurity, and infrastructure deficits persist, particularly outside Pyongyang, reflecting the continued prioritization of military, elite, and regime survival over broad-based development. Kim Jong-un's leadership style combines authoritarian control with pragmatic adaptation. While purges, surveillance, and ideological indoctrination reinforce absolute authority, the regime has also demonstrated flexibility in permitting informal economic activity, engaging in selective diplomacy and modernizing urban centers. This duality allows the state to maintain ideological coherence, military readiness, and internal stability while navigating external pressures, economic constraints, and social realities. Socially and culturally, the Kim regime has continued to emphasize loyalty, historical narrative, and collective identity. Mass games, public performances, and educational programs reinforce ideological commitment, while the personality cult presents Kim Jong-un as both the inheritor of his father's and grandfather's legacies and a capable, modern leader. Religion remains suppressed, and independent civil society is non-existent, ensuring that the regime maintains a monopoly over public life, cultural expression, and historical memory. By 2020 to 2021, North Korea faced renewed economic pressure due to COVID-19 related border closures, sanctions, and agricultural challenges. Yet the regime emphasized self-reliance and resilience, echoing the historical narrative of survival through hardship. Kim's leadership has therefore been defined not only by technological and military advancements, but also by the regime's ability to adapt, survive, and maintain control in the face of persistent internal and external challenges. In conclusion, Kim Jong-un's era represents a continuation and evolution of the North Korean state. He inherited a militarized, ideologically rigid, and centrally controlled country, and under his leadership, it has become a nuclear-capable, diplomatically visible, and strategically assertive state. The combination of military-first governance, selective economic adaptation, and personality cult consolidation has allowed the DPRK to maintain internal stability, project strength internationally, and survive in a hostile global environment. The legacy of Kim Jong-un's rule will be judged by the balance between authoritarian control, military ambition, economic survival, and the ability of the regime to navigate the complex geopolitics of the 21st century. Life inside North Korea is shaped by a combination of strict ideological control, hierarchical social structures, and limited access to external information. From the time of Kim Il-sung's founding of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in 1948 through the famine of the 1990s, to the present leadership of Kim Jong-un, the everyday existence of North Koreans has been tightly regulated by the state. To understand contemporary North Korean society, one must consider the interplay between ideology, governance, and social adaptation that has evolved over decades. At the heart of social organization is the Songbun system, which classifies citizens according to their perceived political loyalty, family background, and historical behavior. Songbun, established during the 1950s, divides the population into three primary categories: core, wavering, and hostile. Those classified as core enjoy privileged access to education, housing, employment, and military positions. The wavering category faces moderate restrictions, while hostile individuals and their descendants are often excluded from prestigious opportunities and live under surveillance. This system governs nearly every aspect of life, determining access to food, healthcare, education, and even geographic location. Songbun is hereditary, ensuring that loyalty or perceived disloyalty can impact multiple generations. Education in North Korea is tightly controlled and highly centralized. From primary school through university, curricula are heavily infused with ideological instruction, emphasizing the achievements of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un. Textbooks present history through the lens of revolutionary struggle and resistance against foreign imperialism, framing the nation's past as a continuous fight for independence and survival. Civics education reinforces obedience, collective responsibility, and loyalty to the Workers' Party of Korea. Students participate in rituals, such as morning flag-raising ceremonies, and learn songs, dances, and recitations extolling the virtues of the leadership. Higher education often includes military and technical training, ensuring that graduates are ideologically aligned and capable of contributing to the state's strategic priorities. Employment is largely determined by state assignment, particularly in urban centers and critical industries. Jobs in government, military, and state-run enterprises provide stable access to resources, housing, and social prestige. Rural populations primarily engage in agriculture, often under collective farming structures, though the 1990s famine and subsequent emergence of markets allowed for increasing private and informal agricultural activities. In urban and rural areas alike, the government monitors labor productivity and loyalty, reinforcing compliance through both incentives and punitive measures. Housing reflects social hierarchy. In Pyongyang and other major cities, the state allocates apartments and housing complexes preferentially to elites and loyal citizens. High-rise apartments constructed during Kim Jong-un's leadership served both as housing and as propaganda, symbolizing the regime's modernity and capacity to provide for its supporters. Rural housing tends to be more basic, with limited access to electricity, running water, and heating, particularly outside showcase projects. Disparities in living conditions underscore the centrality of Songbun and the regime's prioritization of loyalty and control over equitable distribution. Food and nutrition remain central concerns in daily life. Rationing, managed by the state, continues to allocate rice, maize, and other staples, though supply is limited, particularly in rural areas and among lower Songbun classes. The arduous March famine of 1994 to 1998 left a lasting legacy, and the memory of scarcity shapes both individual behavior and collective social structures. To cope with shortages, citizens increasingly rely on Jangmadang markets, which allow for buying, selling, and bartering goods outside official state channels. These markets emerged in the 1990s as a survival mechanism and remain crucial to household economies. They reflect both the ingenuity of the population and the regime's cautious tolerance of limited economic flexibility. Access to information is tightly restricted. Television, radio, and newspapers are state-controlled, and content emphasizes leadership accomplishments, revolutionary history, and national ideology. Foreign media is prohibited, though smuggling of USB drives, DVDs, and radios from China allows some citizens limited exposure to outside perspectives. The government employs surveillance networks to monitor communications, ensuring that deviation from state narratives is detected and punished. Internet access is minimal, restricted primarily to elites, research institutions, and government offices. The combination of restricted information and propaganda ensures that the majority of citizens experience a worldview dominated by state ideology. Healthcare in North Korea is nominally universal, but quality varies dramatically by region and social class. Urban centers, particularly Pyongyang, have better facilities and access to trained medical personnel, while rural areas suffer from shortages of medicine, equipment, and qualified staff. Chronic malnutrition and economic limitations exacerbate health challenges, particularly in areas affected by floods, droughts, or food scarcity. International organizations, such as the World Food Program and UNICEF, have intermittently provided aid to mitigate food insecurity and improve health outcomes, though access is strictly controlled and often limited to politically approved areas. Social life and culture are also highly structured. Public celebrations, mass games, and performances such as the Arirang Festival reinforce ideological messaging and collective identity. Citizens participate in these events both as performers and spectators, symbolically demonstrating loyalty, unity, and obedience. Religious expression is heavily restricted, with state-sanctioned churches existing primarily for diplomatic or propagandistic purposes, while private religious activity is virtually non-existent. Traditional cultural practices persist, but they are often reframed to align with revolutionary and patriotic narratives. Despite these restrictions, North Koreans exhibit remarkable resilience and adaptability. Families and communities develop informal networks to support one another, particularly in acquiring food, goods, and information. Market activities, clandestine cross-border trade, and creative survival strategies reveal the population's resourcefulness. Ordinary citizens navigate the tension between survival and compliance, balancing loyalty to the regime with practical strategies for meeting basic needs. These adaptations reflect both the pressures of the state and the ingenuity of human communities under restrictive conditions. Youth are especially targeted for ideological instruction. Organizations like the Kim Il-sungist Kim Jong-ilist Youth League provide both socialization and political education, ensuring that loyalty to the leadership is ingrained from an early age. Children participate in patriotic activities, volunteer work, and state ceremonies, which both socialize them into the regime's values and prepare them to assume roles in governance, the military, or technical industries. School curricula emphasize revolutionary history, the achievements of the Kim dynasty, and the importance of collective over individual identity. Daily life in rural areas is similarly shaped by state structures, but survival often depends on individual and family initiative. Agriculture is both a source of subsistence and a site of semi-legal entrepreneurial activity. Rural families grow crops for personal use and to trade in local markets. Access to electricity, clean water, and modern amenities is limited, reinforcing inequalities between urban and rural populations. Natural disasters, such as floods or droughts, continue to pose significant risks, highlighting the ongoing vulnerability of the population outside centralized urban areas. The role of the military permeates civilian life. Military parades, public ceremonies, and the visibility of soldiers reinforce the centrality of the Korean People's Army. Military service is mandatory for men and optional for women, and it often provides enhanced social status, access to resources, and a pathway for career advancement. Military loyalty is also critical for regime stability, ensuring that armed forces remain a tool of both defense and political enforcement. The visibility of military culture reinforces national unity, obedience, and ideological cohesion throughout society. Daily survival strategies often require navigating informal economies and black market activities. The population engages in bartering, small-scale trade, and clandestine business ventures to supplement meager rations and limited state-provided goods. Smuggling across the Chinese border remains a significant source of food and consumer goods, particularly for families living in northern provinces. These activities, though technically illegal, are tacitly tolerated in many cases as the regime balances the need for survival with the imperative of ideological control. Defector testimonies, collected since the 1990s and increasingly documented in the 2000s and 2010s, provide critical insight into life inside the country. Accounts detail extreme hardships, systemic surveillance, and social hierarchies, but also remarkable resourcefulness, resilience, and adaptability among ordinary citizens. These narratives highlight the complex interplay between coercion, ideology, and human ingenuity, revealing a society that, despite severe constraints, continues to survive, adapt, and maintain social cohesion. In the digital age, even limited exposure to external information challenges the state's information monopoly. Smuggled media, ranging from South Korean dramas to Western films, offers a glimpse of life beyond the DPRK's borders, influencing tastes, aspirations, and perceptions of opportunity. While access remains highly restricted, these incursions into the controlled information environment underscore the persistent tension between state authority and human curiosity. The intersection of ideology, survival, and daily life defines North Korea's unique social landscape. Citizens internalize the state's narratives, participate in organized rituals, and navigate restrictions, while simultaneously employing creative strategies to meet practical needs. Market activity, informal networks, and community cooperation coexist with surveillance, propaganda, and hierarchical control. This duality characterizes the lived experience inside the walls of North Korea, constrained yet adaptive, surveilled yet resilient, ideologically framed yet pragmatically navigated. In sum, life inside North Korea is defined by the intricate interplay of governance, ideology, and survival. The Songbun system, controlled education, restricted media, and militarized culture shape opportunities, expectations, and behaviors. Meanwhile, informal markets, family networks, and adaptive strategies demonstrate resilience, creativity, and resourcefulness. This environment has been forged over decades of centralized control, famine, sanctions, and isolation, and it continues to define the experiences of North Koreans today. Understanding these dynamics is essential to comprehending not only the society itself, but also the enduring stability of the regime that governs it. North Korea's interactions with the world have always been shaped by a combination of survival strategy, ideological steadfastness, and geopolitical calculation. From the early Cold War era to the present, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, has pursued a policy aimed at preserving sovereignty, deterring external threats, and maximizing leverage through strategic brinkmanship. The division of the Korean Peninsula in 1945, which placed the North under Soviet influence and the South under American occupation, laid the foundation for decades of isolation and militarized diplomacy. During Kim Jong-il's rule, 1994 to 2011, North Korea's foreign relations were dominated by efforts to secure economic aid, technological cooperation, and diplomatic recognition, particularly in response to sanctions imposed due to its nuclear program. These dynamics continued under Kim Jong-un. Early in his rule, North Korea maintained reliance on China, its principal ally, for trade, energy, and diplomatic support. China has consistently acted as both a lifeline and a moderating influence, balancing sanctions enforcement with humanitarian assistance. Russia, too, has periodically engaged economically and politically, particularly in energy, infrastructure, and trade agreements, though its influence is secondary to China's. The DPRK's most consequential relationships involve its southern neighbor, South Korea, and the United States. Inter-Korean relations fluctuate between periods of hostility and engagement. In 2018, Kim Jong-un met South Korean President Moon Jae-in at the Panmunjom Summit, pledging cooperation, military de-escalation, and future dialogue. This was followed by subsequent summits and symbolic gestures, such as joint ceremonial events and agreements on family reunions, though many commitments were slow to materialize. Engagement with South Korea remains a delicate balance, fostering economic cooperation while asserting North Korea's strategic independence. Relations with the United States are heavily influenced by the DPRK's nuclear and missile programs. North Korea conducted several high-profile nuclear tests and missile launches between 2016 to 2017, including the Hwasong-14 and Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missiles, which demonstrated the potential capability to strike U.S. territory. These developments triggered international condemnation, intensified sanctions, and prompted diplomatic overtures. Notably, the 2018 to 2019 U.S. North Korea summits with President Donald Trump offered a rare opportunity for direct negotiation, although tangible agreements on denuclearization and sanctions relief proved limited. North Korea also utilizes cyber capabilities, missile demonstrations, and nuclear testing as bargaining tools in international diplomacy. These strategies reinforce the regime's image of resilience and deterrence, while providing leverage in negotiations with multiple states simultaneously. The DPRK positions itself as a state willing to endure hardship rather than compromise its sovereignty, leveraging history, ideology, and military capacity to maintain both domestic legitimacy and international relevance. In summary, North Korea's relationship with the world is defined by strategic pragmatism, ideological rigidity, and geopolitical calculation. Its survival depends on managing alliances with China and Russia, balancing engagement and confrontation with South Korea, and leveraging nuclear capabilities and diplomacy with the United States and the broader international community. The DPRK's external posture is inseparable from its internal logic of survival, sovereignty, and the maintenance of the Kim dynasty, reflecting decades of historical experience and the unique pressures of its geopolitical position. North Korea is a nation shaped as much by myth and ideology as by geography and history. The DPRK's story is a complex blend of historical trauma, revolutionary fervor, and the deliberate construction of a narrative to maintain political control. From the guerrilla exploits of Kim Il-sung during the Japanese occupation of Korea in the 1930s, 1945 to the rise of his grandson Kim Jong-un in the 2010s, the state has cultivated myths that reinforce loyalty, unity, and obedience, ensuring the survival of the regime amid a hostile international environment. These myths serve both domestic and international purposes, portraying North Korea as a nation that has endured invasion, famine, and isolation while remaining resilient, sovereign, and ideologically pure. The myth-making process begins with Kim Il-sung, the founding father of the DPRK. His biography, heavily embellished through state propaganda, presents him as a heroic guerrilla leader who fought tirelessly against Japanese occupation in Manchuria and Korea during the late 1930s and early 1940s. According to North Korean narratives, Kim's leadership was instrumental in liberating Korea from colonial rule. While his participation in anti-Japanese activities is historically verified, state accounts exaggerate and mythologize his exploits, portraying him as almost superhuman. This narrative established a template for leadership that emphasizes invincibility, moral rectitude, and divine-like authority, which subsequent leaders have continued to cultivate. Kim Jong-il, who assumed power in 1994, inherited this mythology and expanded it with additional layers. His birth in 1941, officially 1942 in North Korean accounts, in the Soviet Union or on Mount Peak-2, is portrayed as miraculous, emphasizing a predestined path toward leadership. The Sungun, or military first, policy, formalized in 1995 to 1997, was framed not merely as a pragmatic strategy, but as a continuation of a historical struggle linking military prowess to the survival of the nation. The narrative of overcoming the arduous March famine, 1994 to 1998, reinforced the idea that the DPRK and its leadership could endure hardship without succumbing to foreign pressure, further embedding the mythology of resilience and self-reliance. Under Kim Jong-un, these myths have been modernized and adapted to a 21st century context. The narrative emphasizes both continuity and innovation. The young leader is portrayed as the inheritor of his father's and grandfather's legacies, yet also as a dynamic, capable, and visionary modernizer. State media frames nuclear weapons tests, missile launches, and selective urban modernization projects as evidence of North Korea's sovereignty, ingenuity, and resilience. Kim's personal image is carefully curated, emphasizing strength, decisiveness, and even a relatable human side in domestic portrayals, while externally projecting a posture of strategic defiance. The myth of North Korean exceptionalism extends beyond leadership. The DPRK presents itself as a nation that has survived centuries of invasion, colonization, and geopolitical marginalization. From resisting Chinese dynasties, Japanese occupation, 1910 to 1945, to surviving the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, the narrative frames external pressures as evidence of North Korea's resilience. Famine, economic sanctions, and isolation are portrayed not as weaknesses but as tests of endurance, reinforcing collective identity and solidarity. Geography, the rugged mountains, harsh winters, and relative isolation are integrated into this narrative, symbolizing natural protection and the shaping of a strong, independent people. Cultural and educational institutions reinforce these myths. School curricula, youth organizations, public performances, and media outlets emphasize historical continuity, revolutionary struggle, and loyalty to the Kim dynasty. Mass games, such as the Arirang Festival, dramatize historical and ideological narratives, visually symbolizing the unity of the population and the leadership's omnipresence. Historical revisionism is evident, with selective emphasis on victories and struggles that support state ideology, while inconvenient truths or failures are minimized or omitted. These myths permeate daily life, from rituals in schools and workplaces to public holidays celebrating revolutionary milestones, ensuring that citizens internalize the state's constructed narrative from an early age. Externally, these myths serve strategic purposes. By cultivating an image of an indomitable and sovereign nation, North Korea positions itself as a state that cannot be coerced easily, reinforcing its bargaining power in negotiations over nuclear programs, sanctions, and aid. The combination of myth, military capability, and ideological messaging enhances deterrence, signals resilience to adversaries, and frames diplomatic engagement on North Korea's terms. For example, the nuclear tests conducted between 2016 to 2017 were not only strategic and technical achievements, but also symbolic demonstrations of the regime's narrative of strength and survival. Looking to the future, the persistence of these myths will continue to shape North Korea's trajectory. Demographic pressures, economic challenges, climate vulnerability, and international sanctions pose enduring risks. Yet the regime has repeatedly demonstrated adaptability, using controlled economic reforms, selective engagement with the international community, and technological investments to maintain stability. The mythology of resilience, self-reliance, Juche, and collective endurance remains central to the regime's legitimacy, providing a narrative framework through which citizens interpret hardship and compliance. The continuity of leadership within the Kim dynasty, reinforced by myth and ideology, also raises questions about succession and stability. While Kim Jong-un has consolidated power since 2011, the future may depend on the regime's ability to maintain loyalty, adapt to technological and economic pressures, and manage internal and external expectations. Internationally, North Korea faces a delicate balance, maintaining strategic deterrence, engaging selectively with diplomatic partners, and navigating an increasingly complex geopolitical landscape, including China, the United States, South Korea, and regional actors. The myths of invincibility and self-reliance are essential tools in this balancing act, shaping both perception and policy. Ultimately, the story of North Korea is a story of survival, myth-making, and strategic calculation. Its people navigate daily life within a system built on hierarchy, ideology, and surveillance, while the leadership relies on narrative, symbolism, and power consolidation to maintain control. From Kim Il-sung's guerrilla campaigns to Kim Jong-un's nuclear diplomacy, the DPRK has continuously woven myth and history into a cohesive narrative that sustains the state, justifies hardship, and defines identity. The future of North Korea, like its past, will be inseparable from the myths it constructs, the resilience it demonstrates, and the delicate interplay between domestic control and global engagement.